Raising a Socially Successful Child by Dr. Stephen Nowicki. Chapter 5. Personal Space. That's close enough. Every Tuesday, for the past 27 years, I've left the confines of the Emory campus and driven out of the greater Atlanta community to consult with the staff of a program responsible for treating severely emotionally disturbed children and adolescents. Because of the nature of the diagnosis, I'm never quite sure what to expect when I arrive at the center. On one spring morning, I walked through the doors of the main entrance, and I began my circuit around the building to check in with staff about problems they were encountering with the children. As I walked into one of the classrooms, a gangly 6-foot tall 14-year-old named Raul, who was sitting in the front row, got up from his desk and began walking toward me. I watched his approach with interest and waited for him to stop and say something, but he just kept coming forward. I decided to stay put and see how close he would come before he stopped. When he did come to a halt, we were just about nose to nose. Inches from my face, he said, "Good morning, Dr. Nowicki. How are you?" I could feel his breath on me, and it was difficult to bring his face into focus. "I'm fine, Raul. How are you?" I replied. "I'm fine too," he answered. "It's a nice day, isn't it?" "Yes, it is. But it would be an even nicer day if you took just one step back." Then I asked him to put his arm out in front of him to measure the space between us, and said, "That's about the right distance you should be away from others when you greet them." Unbeknownst to me, the staff had been working with Raul on improving social skills, especially how he greeted others, and had decided to test what they had taught Raul on me. But while the staff had successfully given Raul the appropriate words to use when greeting someone in the morning, they had apparently forgotten to teach him about the equally important nonverbal communication channel of personal space, the invisible bubble between ourselves and others through which most of our nonverbal messages must pass. Why personal space matters. Like other animals, we humans evolved with a natural instinct to protect our territory from outside interlopers. We notice if a stranger appears on our front yard. We become concerned if an unknown car enters our driveway, even if it is just to back out and go in another direction. When we have dinner guests or throw parties, we would not be thrilled to find a guest rummaging through the drawers in our bedroom. And we are equally possessive about our personal space, the portable force field that extends out from our bodies and into our social world. When someone encroaches on our personal space, as Raoul did with me, it usually triggers what's known as a flight reaction, a reflexive response to threat. We shrink back or step sideways. We try to reclaim the space we've lost. Personal space researcher and neuropsychologist Michael Graziano has identified the specialized neurons in the brain that activate this instinctive response. He calls them peripersonal neurons and explains that they act like Geiger counters, scanning our immediate surrounding area, gathering relevant information about how far away other people or objects are, then triggering a response when they sense our personal space is being encroached upon. Want to see this monitoring system in action? Just watch how crowds of people crossing a street from opposite corners avoid crashing into one another. Even though some walkers are not paying attention to one another or are even looking down at their phones, it really is quite astonishing. To help my psychology students at Emory better understand the function of their peripersonal neurons and become more aware of their personal space boundaries, I usually stage a classroom demonstration. I ask two students to stand at opposite sides of the room, about 20 or so feet apart. And tell them to start walking toward each other. Then I ask them to stop as soon as they begin to feel uncomfortable. They will usually slow to a complete halt at about a 4-foot distance from the other person. Though this will invariably vary depending on their gender and cultural background. What doesn't vary, however, is what the students do when they reach their threshold of comfort. They not only choose to stop, but they rock backward as though they have bumped into something solid. Their peripersonal neuronal warning system has been activated, warning them of threat. As we go about our everyday lives, we're always trying to maintain a comfortable distance from others. Whether we're aware of it or not, we are constantly adjusting this calculation depending on where we are, whom we're with, and how we feel. When we feel anxious, we step away from others to protect ourselves. When we feel comfortable and at ease, we allow others to come closer. In his 1966 book, The Hidden Dimension, cultural anthropologist Edward T. Hall described what are still considered the accepted zones of personal space for most Americans. The first of these is the intimate zone, and it extends out to about 18 inches. We usually permit only close friends and family into this space. When operating within this space, we tend to exchange private information and feelings, lowering our voices if there are others in the room so that only those in our intimate space can hear the exchange. For children, learning to control this volume of their voices within this closest zone is sometimes difficult, and they may whisper loudly. Just beyond the intimate zone is the personal region, extending out to about 4 feet or so. A significant number of our everyday interactions take place within this zone. When you meet an acquaintance on the street, this is the usual amount of space you will leave between the two of you, the same distance you might leave when speaking to a clerk in a store, or a neighbor at the end of the driveway. While speech is louder here than in the intimate zone, it still is relatively private. If someone happens to walk past such an interaction between two people, they may overhear what is being said, but norms dictate they will make every attempt to ignore it and not join in. The next zone is what Hall calls out social space, which stretches from 4 feet out to around 12 feet. We can raise our voices in this zone because we intend for others to be able to hear what we're discussing. A tour guide or a teacher standing in a classroom of 20 students might make use of this zone because we're easily seen and heard from this space. Intimate or personal matters tend not to be discussed here. Finally, we have the public zone, which extends out beyond the 12-foot limit of the social zone. Public events, such as speeches, occur in this space, but not much social interaction. At this distance, we can read what someone's posture might be telling us, but our gestures and other nonverbal behaviors have to be more exaggerated to be noticed. Regardless of distance, our peripersonal neurons constantly monitor each one of these zones for signs of threat. Hall notes that we share with animals an innate ability to quickly establish our level of comfort with intruders. But unlike animals, we learn to modify these calculations based on experiences with our families, our communities, and the prevailing social norms. As a result, the size of our space bubbles will, to a certain degree, depend on the behaviors we observed in our home, as well as the country and culture into which we're born. For example, people from the United States and the United Kingdom have the biggest space bubbles, whereas people from Southern Europe and the Middle East are happy to be in much closer range. Sometimes, however, we're forced to adapt to a situation in which our bubble is invaded by a complete stranger. Picture yourself standing alone in the back of an empty elevator. Your posture is relaxed, slightly slumped. The elevator stops at a floor, the doors open, and the scene changes dramatically as someone enters. You immediately stand up straighter, and then you and the new passenger mentally divide up the elevator territory into equal halves, and you each instinctively retreat to your side. However, as more passengers enter, the elevator becomes crowded, forcing your personal space bubble to contract, allowing complete strangers into a zone where you would usually feel threatened. How are we able to continue standing in the elevator without our peripersonal neurons telling us to flee? By doing everything we can to convince ourselves that we're actually alone. We look straight ahead, eyes glued to the doors, or we stand downward at the floor or at our phone. We do a version of this for hours on end when sitting next to a stranger on an airplane as well. Next time you find yourself in an elevator with multiple people, turn your head slightly, about 5 degrees, to the right or left and see what happens. This slight head movement destroys the illusion of being alone for all of you, and you're likely to get a somewhat hostile, nonverbal reaction from the person next to you, a sort of, What are you looking at? Expression. While Hall envisioned these zones as a series of concentric rings, with us at the center, research I conducted with Marshall Duke, my colleague at Emory, suggests that our personal space bubbles aren't shaped like perfect circles. In our study, we took a simple drawing of a room with a dot in the center and concentric circles going out to the periphery. We asked thousands of individuals to imagine themselves standing in the center of the room. Then we asked them to indicate where they would like various people of different ages, genders, and races to stop when walking toward them from the front, back, and sides. For younger children, we used Fisher Price figures to make the visualization task easier for them. The study provided us with a wealth of information about learned norms around personal space, including a detailed picture of what our personal space zones look like. The first thing we noticed is that people's personal space bubbles were deeper at the back than at the front. This makes sense as the primary function of personal space is to act as an early warning system to protect us from physical harm. People can both see and hear possible threats approaching from the front, but can only use sound when evaluating threats coming from behind. As a result, they need extra space behind them in order to feel safe. From these data, we constructed the Comfortable Interpersonal Distance Scale, which measures the preferred interpersonal distance as a function of race, age, and gender. In general, we found that women seem to prefer more space around them than men, and older adults seemed to require more distance than younger ones. Young children have the smallest protective space bubble of all, but they're a lot less discerning about whom they let into their personal space zone than adults. Not only does allowing for the correct amount of personal space help make others feel more comfortable around us, it provides the medium through which other nonverbal behaviors, such as facial expressions, postures, gestures, vocalics, and touch, must pass. The greater the distance, the harder it is to pick up on emotional cues from the other nonverbal channels. Faces become more difficult to read, and tones of voice become more challenging to identify. Equally, if someone is standing too close, we feel encroached upon and have a harder time focusing on that person's facial expressions or gestures. So, children who have difficulty understanding personal space can struggle in manifold ways. Neuropsychologist Michael Graziano had spent his career studying personal space, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened when his 4-year-old son started having problems at school. Graziano's son was happy, smart, and talkative, but the young boy had difficulties moving through space and would frequently trip, crash into furniture, and fall out of his chair. The problems escalated when he began first grade, when teachers perceived his rocking and jiggling at his desk as sexual gestures, and his accidental bumping into others as a form of sexual assault. The boys' school even reported Graziano and his wife to Child Protective Services as possible child abusers. Eventually, experts were able to present a different and science based interpretation of the boy's behavior. It turned out that Graziano's son was suffering from dyspraxia. Those with this disorder experience a variety of difficulties, but in the boy's case, the most striking symptom was the malfunctioning of his peripersonal neurons. This intervention cleared the parents' names, and the child was able to receive the help he needed, albeit at another school. As one of the leading researchers in the discovery of neural mechanisms underlying the use of personal space, Graziano understood why his son could not correctly process where his body was in relation to others. But he was still stunned by the real-life consequences of his son's inability to finesse his movements in the space around him. I studied personal space in the lab. For years I studied the brain basis of it, he wrote in his book, The Spaces Between Us. But I was in no way prepared for its full human dimensions. Personal space is the fundamental scaffold of human interaction. A vast, invisible presence affecting us all of the time. It was this experience with his son that opened Graziano's eyes to how truly important managing personal space can be, even for someone as young as 4 years old. Ask any teacher, and they will tell you about their experiences with space invaders in the classroom. Children who constantly hover, touch, and violate the personal space of others. Although these behaviors are usually not the result of a severe neurological disorder, as was the case with Graziano's son, even trivial mistakes can have very real personal consequences. If a child repeatedly invades the space of other children, even when this happens accidentally and without malice, you can bet that the child's classmates will learn to keep a wide berth, leading to feelings of social isolation for the child if not corrected. During the pandemic, of course, children were explicitly taught about personal space in the form of social distancing. Outlines of feet were painted on floors, and colorful tape appeared on sidewalks and hallways, reminding them how far away they were supposed to stand from others. The 6-foot rule, which was so helpful in the public health crisis, also had the unfortunate side effect of obliterating the traditional interpersonal zones we have long used. Harvard Medical School professor Daphne Holt found that during the pandemic, personal space preferences had increased 40 to 50% on average in people she tested, especially if they perceived a higher overall risk of being infected with COVID-19. Interestingly, however, those who were more frightened about catching the virus kept greater distances from others, even when interacting in a simulated virtual test environment where there was no possibility of being infected. It's possible the pandemic-era rules around personal space created further problems for children who were already struggling with this nonverbal channel. One of the key ways in which children learn the rules of personal space, as well as other nonverbal skills, is through trial and error. And when spatial boundaries are strictly delineated and enforced, as they were during the pandemic, children have fewer opportunities to practice and learn those rules on their own. It's not clear if pandemic enforced rules will impact children's perceptions about what constitutes an appropriate amount of personal space over the long run. But what do we know is that what we do know is that they will have to learn or relearn how to identify and respect their own special boundaries, as well as the boundaries of others, in spaces where appropriate distance are not explained, explicitly prescribed. Needless to say, the increasing amount of time spent on screens has not helped our children's understanding and use of personal space. More and more, young people are conducting large portions of their lives in cyberspace, a place that has no physical dimension and gives us erroneous information about space and its parameters. Moreover, with fewer opportunities to learn about and practice the appropriate amount of space to leave between themselves and others during actual in person social interactions, it makes sense that some kids will struggle with understanding personal space boundaries. Not long ago, I was talking with a teacher outside her room in a school hallway when one of her students, a 7-year-old boy, walked in a straight line between us instead of around us, even though there was plenty of room. After he passed, the teacher called out, "Zeke, where are you supposed to walk when two people are talking?" His response was a vacant and lost expression. The good news is because most mistakes in personal space are due to a lack of learning or experience, they can typically be corrected easily. In a very practical way, the pandemic enforced 6-foot rule was an excellent example of how to go about teaching the appropriate use of personal space. For many people, personal space bubbles became visible for the first time, and we quickly learned new ways of interacting with one another by actively adjusting them. If your child is struggling with personal space boundaries, you can help by explicitly demonstrating the correct space to leave between her own body and those of others. Personal space in infancy and early childhood. At what point do babies develop an awareness of personal space? One answer comes from psychologist Thomas Horner, who looked closely at how infants reacted to strangers during the first year of their lives. Up to around 6 months of age, children typically react to hovering and cheek pinching strangers positively and indiscriminately, and without apparent fear. However, around 6 months, a change occurs, and children begin to be more wary of strangers, even reacting with distress to some, especially when the stranger controls the interaction and intrudes into the child's personal space. It's during this transition age that Dr. Horner puts it, infants become like customs inspectors trying to discern if someone is about to bring illegal goods into their country. Another study conducted by psychologists in Birmingham, England, found that a peripersonal neuron system already exists to some degree even in newborn babies. While there is some debate around when exactly that system becomes operable, there is strong evidence to suggest that at 6 months, babies begin to develop an observational self, which allows them to both discern who's entering their personal space and determine the potential threat of that person. For that reason, as babies approach the 6 month mark, parents need to be judicious about the kinds of interactions they allow their infants to have and the spatial area within which those interactions take place. Too often, I've observed well intentioned adults intruding into the intimate zone when introducing themselves to a child, even taking the child's hand or hugging them without warning or permission. Adults, and especially adults who are strangers to the child, must take care to respect that space rather than invade it. At this age, children need to feel safe with someone before inviting them to share their space. No wonder then that infants cling to caregivers and toddlers will only make brief forays away before returning quickly to the safety of their parents' bubble. Slowly but surely, and with the guidance of parents, children begin to venture farther and begin to learn the appropriate distance to keep both from adults they know and from strangers. At the same time, they start to develop a reflexive response to someone coming too close for comfort. Research shows that when infants and young children feel secure in the presence of their caregivers, they are more likely to explore their environments. Including the people that inhabit them, which gives them opportunities to learn about the nuances of personal space that will prepare them for future social interactions. In fact, researchers from Israel found that children who trusted their caregivers more in infancy not only tended to be more intrepid explorers, they were also more resistant to intrusions from others, less likely to allow unwanted others into their personal space, and more interpersonally competent a decade later. For parents, teaching basic use of personal space is a study in patience and active modeling. Keep in mind that the younger the child, the more likely it is that she will keep a similar distance from most anyone, whether a stranger or a family member. That will change as she moves toward the end of early childhood and gains exposure to a broader range of people and interactions. Tips for making personal space visible and concrete for your very young child. Talk about personal space bubbles with your child. You can explain to her that everyone has a space bubble and that it's important to respect those of others. When in public spaces, warn your child not to crash into people and help her become more aware of the people around her. Make your child's space bubble visible and concrete. You can mark a 4 foot by 4 foot space around your child on the floor using colorful masking tape to help her understand the parameters of her space bubble. Alternatively, if you have a hula hoop, you can get your child to step inside the hoop and walk around carrying it. Play green light, red light. Green light, red light's a great game to play to help make children aware of one another's personal space. Green light means move closer, red light means stop. If you don't have a group of children to play with, you could replicate the game using toy cars, showing how each car needs space around it to travel safely, and that drivers need to follow the rules of green light and red light so they don't crash. Good training also for 15 years later when your child needs to learn to drive. Learn to respect your child's own personal space. Your child is a growing individual who needs to have some control over who appears in her space and how close people are allowed to be. A lot of adults, including parents and close family members, don't appreciate the importance of allowing a child to decide who gets to enter her personal space. Respecting a child's spatial boundaries, even at an early age, instills an important lesson about respecting the spatial boundaries of others. Personal space in late childhood. Around the time your child begins full-time school, she will have to become much more adept in understanding the rules of personal space. She'll need to know how far to stand from others while waiting in line, when it's appropriate to come close to a friend in the schoolyard, and when it's not. It's quite normal for children to struggle with these boundaries at first, and in different ways. One child may hug others without permission, while another might be prone to unwittingly bumping into peers. One may intrude on a group of classmates by wedging himself into their circle, while another might sit too far away from his lunch companion at the cafeteria table. Research published from my lab, as well as others, shows that by the age of 6, most children have become quite discerning about whom they let into their bubble and whom they keep out. Typically at this age, children will allow peers of the same sex closer to them than those of the opposite sex. But 2 girls are generally comfortable with less space between them than 2 boys are. But for the majority of children at this age, the peripersonal neurons start firing whenever someone approaches them. That's why older children who continue to violate the space of peers are more likely to be rejected socially. While a 5-year-old can move in close to play next to another child without consequence, that may not be an acceptable action for a 7-year-old. And by around 10 years of age, children will be expected to follow rules as if they were adults. When children are able to confidently navigate personal space boundaries, they have a much easier time making and maintaining friendships, and not just because their peers are less likely to reject them. Space is the way we communicate closeness, not only physically but socially as well. As such, it plays a role in all 4 stages of any relationship, though its role is particularly significant when initiating and deepening relationships. Once a child is ready to initiate a possible relationship with another child, she will need to maintain the correct distance in order for the new friend to see her facial expressions and hear her words, but not be so close that her overture is seen as intrusive. Imagine a young boy. Let's call him Austin. Playing on the playground during recess on the first day at a new school. He sees a classmate prodding something on the ground with a stick. He walks over. Austin stands at a slight distance as he doesn't know the other child yet. "What is it?" he calls out. "A really big, strange hug," the other boy replies. A bug, excuse me. A really big, strange bug. "Can I see it?" Austin requests. "Sure, but be careful," the other boy cautions. Now that the other boy has invited Austin into his personal space, Austin moves closer. "Wow, I've never seen anything like that before," he tells the other boy. As the two boys observe the bug standing almost shoulder to shoulder, a friendship has been initiated based on a shared interest. The boys soon learn each other's names and later in the day discover they both enjoy playing basketball after school. Although Austin's behavior may not seem all that noteworthy, in fact, he's done a great job navigating personal space to successfully initiate a new relationship. He asked permission before approaching, then closed the space slowly, giving the other boy time to become comfortable with his approach. And at the end of the day of it all, they stood comfortably together, ready to get to know each other better. Imagine how different it might have been if Austin had run over and immediately sidled up beside the other boy with no regard for his personal space boundaries. When two people reduce the space between them, as Austin and his new friend did, they create the conditions for the relationship to deepen. Because almost all nonverbal communication, including facial expressions, postures, gestures, and so on, takes place within the intimate and personal zones. Two children who can share this space more comfortably have access to nonverbal information from each other that others don't. This is how children can form that chum relationship Harry Stack Sullivan wrote about, a special friendship in which children learn to share secrets, trust each other's opinion, and hone their interpersonal skills. Children who learn to master these foundational rules in late childhood will be that much better prepared to navigate the future and often sexualized relationships of adolescence, where personal space errors can have far more negative consequences. In other words, it's never too early to teach your child about how to navigate personal space. Tips for helping children navigate personal space during late childhood. Observe your child in a variety of social situations. Parents are often unaware when their school-age child has problems with personal space, as space bubbles are generally much smaller at home with family members. It's important, therefore, to observe your child in different situations and settings. Note how far away she stands from others depending on where she is and with whom she's interacting. Does she modify appropriately depending on the type of relationship, moving closer with friends and farther away with strangers? Continue to give your child feedback. Compliment your child when he is mindful of the space of others and gently redirect him when he oversteps boundaries. "I like how you went up to your new friend and stood a nice distance away from him before asking him if he wanted to play. It's not good to bump into people when you're playing with them. it's better to give your friends space. Gradually give your child more freedom to explore her world. In spaces where it is safe to do so, let your child wander off while letting her know how far she can and can't go, and showing that you'll be in the same spot waiting for her when she returns. If your child moves too far away from you too soon, you may feel you need to reprimand her. But if the reprimands are too severe, or, on the other hand, if she is permitted to stray without parental feedback, she will miss out on valuable opportunities to learn the rules for personal space. Ask your child to be a personal space bubble detective. When you're out with your child in public places, you can ask her to observe people standing at different distances from one another and have her tell you what's happening. Do the people know one another? Do they like one another? Do you think they are friends? Family members? While watching people standing in line, see how far they stand from one another. This is another great opportunity to observe personal space rules in action. Have your child walk toward you and then use facial expressions and gestures to show her feelings when it's time to stop. Or to show her when it's time to stop. Sorry. This is a good way to teach your child how to observe personal space rules, while also reinforcing other nonverbal skills. You can also reverse roles and get your child to signal when she wants you to stop. Children need to become aware of how nonverbal cues in facial expressions, tones of voice, postures, and gestures can be useful signals of unwelcome personal space intrusions. Make time to have a conversation about consent. Ask your child if she has ever been made uncomfortable by someone being too close. Reassure her that she has the right to tell others to stop getting closer when she is made uncomfortable by the approach. Children need to acquire both the nonverbal and verbal language to negotiate personal space interactions. If she has trouble asserting her boundaries or asking others about theirs, have her practice phrases like, "You're in my space, please move back," or "Is it okay if I come closer to look at what you're doing?" Teach your child about the difference between intimate, personal, social, and public zones. Explain that you can say personal things in the intimate zone that you wouldn't say in the other zones, and redirect him if, for example, he shouts across a room to discuss an intimate topic. I remember one 10-year-old who wanted to be friends with another child and decided to show his concern for this classmate by shouting loudly across the room, "How's your diarrhea?" Well-meaning and perhaps empathetic, but also a sure way to embarrass and push away a potential friend. Teach your child how to navigate space when inside an elevator. Explain to her that when someone enters the elevator, she should step aside if she can in order to give that person space. This is a great way to help your child practice adjusting her space bubble even in a cramped environment. Observe Personal Space Day, which is celebrated on November 30th. Yes, Personal Space Day exists, and it may provide an opportunity for you and your child to pause and reflect on the importance of respecting the personal boundaries of others. When your child needs expert intervention, The nonverbal channel of personal space becomes ever more important as your child grows older. Early childhood, and especially the transition to full-time school, are crucial times to identify and correct skill gaps before they become more extensive and harmful. If your child's persistently struggling with spatial awareness, it's likely your child's teacher will bring it to your attention. If your child continues to make the same errors, even after teachers repeatedly correct her, you may decide to have her formally assessed by a clinical psychologist or learning disability specialist with experience in personal space, preferences, and behavior. Misusing personal space always impedes the development of relationships, but its impact pale in comparison to the social difficulties that can arise when children or adults make mistakes using touch. As you will see in the next chapter, touch can carry more emotional information than any other nonverbal channel, which means it's all the more imperative for young people to get it right. Next up, physical touch.